Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. Maybe do we give a few minutes for people to join, or do we just start straight out? Okay. I'm not entirely sure if we should wait or not, but maybe should we give them a minute, Janice?
Yeah, we can give them a minute or two. How are you?
Brilliant. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we can just give a few minutes. Okay, Ignacio says we can just start. Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. So this morning we are here with Janice Jackson, and it is a pleasure to be interviewing you today in the framework of this movement of Latin Americans for education, within the framework of this movement for reading comprehension. Janice is joining us from the Aspen Institute. She is Executive Director of Education and Society Programs, and she's also the ex-CEO of Chicago Public Schools. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Janice. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I would like to start off to give you a bit of context on myself. I have been working in education for a while, but I'm based in Chile. So my perspective is the region. And of course, we're very curious to hear your thoughts on your experience, for you to hear your insights and some of the learnings you've had and how we might apply them to Latin America. So to start with, it would be great if you could maybe give us some insights as to maybe the context as to where your work has been carried out mostly, and things that would enlighten us to be able to identify common threads with Latin America so that we can build in and go deeper with the specific projects you've been leading.
All right, sounds good. Well, I will start with the present. As you acknowledged, I am the Executive Director of Ed and Society at the Aspen Institute. And later in our discussion, I'd love to kind of walk you through how we're trying to determine a more global vision for education in the United States. So that's really my charge there, and really excited about some of the programming that we're putting into place. But also I started my career as an educator, as a high school teacher here in Chicago, and worked my way up through all of those roles as a high school teacher, as the principal of 2 schools that we founded and started from scratch, all the way up to senior leadership, where I served as both the chief education officer and the chief executive officer for a period of about 8 years. And during that time, both as a principal and in senior leadership roles, did a fair amount to lead a lot of the academic improvements that CPS experienced. And one of the unique things that I bring to this conversation is that I served in the district, but I'm also a parent of CPS students at the time, and I also was a student in CPS. So I can definitely say over the past 40 years, I have observed the changes that took place and can speak to what the student experience has been over time, and also what role educators and policymakers played in helping us to set a new path forward.
Fantastic. Thank you for that very brilliant introduction, because I think for me, the most important thing is talking to real implementers, but also you have also lived through the whole system, right? Yeah. So as an ex-alum, and the trajectory you've had is very unique. It gives us a lot of insight as to both being a user as well as you being focused on being a practitioner through being a principal, a high school teacher. You know the ins and the outs of the system in a way that very few people, I think, that do. So it's really fantastic to hear you today. In that sense, would you mind maybe running us through, I think, to give everyone sort of context on your work at CPS and today at the Aspen Institute, maybe an overall of what the current context is. Obviously, Chicago, so I think people know have different levels of information about it. So it would be interesting if you could sort of level the playing field around maybe some of the statistics around the education system there, and sort of some of the overview that you would think is relevant to then dig deep.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say to folks is that we engaged in a decades-long reform effort that really started in the late 1980s and still runs through today. I think that's important for people to know, because whenever you're trying to make substantial change in a city, country, et cetera, knowing that it takes time is an important factor. It started, I would say, back in the late 80s and 90s when then Secretary of Education Bill Bennett for the United States visited Chicago and remarked that it was one of the worst school districts in the country. As you can imagine, that was a huge embarrassment for the city. But if you know anything about Chicago, it lit a fire, and I would say it created 40 years of continuous improvement. As I stated, I was a student then at that time, and I know what it was like to be a student in the district, and really the two-tiered system that we had, which is, very few students had access to college preparatory courses and were on a college prep track. That changed over time. For example, we improved our graduation rates dramatically. When we embarked on this reform, about half of the students would graduate in 4 years, half of our senior class. When I left CPS, that number was at 84%. And again, we didn't push a magic button and go from 50% of students graduating to 84. It was a result of sustained continuous improvement over time. And I'll talk a little bit about what gets you this type of improvement in a second, but let me just go through the numbers. Another thing that's impressive about CPS is that CPS was recognized as the fastest growing school district in the country, large urban school district in the country. We were at the 96th percentile for all school systems. So large, small, urban, rural, low income, high income. When the professors at Stanford actually did this analysis, they weren't commissioned by CPS. They were doing an analysis of student growth. CPS stood out as an outlier. And of course, people wanted to know what is happening there. I would say a few things happened. Number one, a strong commitment to college as the North Star, meaning we wanted to prepare students to go to college and be successful. Whether that was their goal or not, we would set them up and make sure they had all of the tools to be successful. A strong focus on literacy as well as data-driven decision-making. I have had a chance to, visit districts and work with districts across the country, and I continue to remark at how CPS is such a strong data-driven district. And then the last thing I'll say from a more strategic standpoint is the focus on leadership. CPS is a large district. We have about 350,000 students, 40,000 teachers and staff. You can't hire 25 or 30,000 teachers, but you can focus on 665 principals, making sure they themselves create strong schools, hire the right educators, and have a strong improvement plan to drive improvements in the district. So that was really the strategy that we implemented, like I said, over the course of 2 decades for sure. And as a result, we saw higher graduation rates, higher college enrollment and completion rates, as well as improved literacy and numeracy rates.
Fantastic. Thank you. Very impressive. I mean, to have lived through this in a short period of time, as you said, I think the most important thing is that change does take time. And I think having a clear roadmap for what you want to achieve in decades, not just years, is a huge difference. I think, as you just stated, 40 years, 4 decades is sufficient time to actually see changes, and you see it through generations, right? So congratulations, absolutely. I think, on that point. Of course. And so to follow up on what you just said, you said part of the strategies was to focus on 665 principles, which actually makes sense because it's a manageable number, right? So what exactly was the work that you did with them, and what were the strategies that you then aligned them all to work upon?
Let me start with the framework that we operate in CPS, because I think that's important. And for those listening in, if they want to read more about this, I would point them to Anthony Brike's work. Tony Brike, who is a professor at University of Chicago, he wrote about the various reform era. So I point them to that. But in Chicago, it is very common for the district as well as the civic and the post-secondary community to work collaboratively on student achievement. So we are blessed that the school system is not left to figure things out and left to their own devices, but instead you have this ecosystem of all of these entities that exist within a city or municipality working together towards this common goal. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So I bring that up because when you think about our when you think about our work with principals, you will see all those factors come into play. So number one, at the beginning of the 2000s, CPS decided that we needed to focus on principal leadership. The first thing that we did is created a more stringent process to become a principal in a district that went beyond what the state said needed to happen. So principals not only had to pass the state test to get that license, but they also had to pass and demonstrate certain competencies to be a principal in CPS. So that's number one. We made it more difficult and we wanted highly skilled people in that role. We also partnered with an organization called the Chicago Public Education Fund, which is a separate nonprofit entity that raises money to support the capacity building of leaders. So they helped us do a few things. They helped us on how to recruit the best leaders, how to give them professional development while they're in the role. And then the last piece, which I think is critically important, is how do you keep your best leaders in the right place? This is an area where I see a lot of districts or entities struggle. You know, they focus on filling the gaps and principal retention, which is critically important initially. But you also have to remember that your high performers are working under incredibly stringent conditions, and that you have to provide them with professional development so that they can continue to grow and develop. The other thing that we did in conjunction with the Public Education Fund is set up strong data systems. So we could look school by school and see how a principal was doing. We could see how parents rated them on their surveys, how that connected to test scores. And so there's a very complex system to look at performance. And if you work in a district, you understand that that's part of how your performance is measured by different entities. I would say the selection process, working directly with universities to make sure their curriculum was preparing these leaders to lead in our district, was critically important. Partnered with local universities like University of Illinois at Chicago, Loyola, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to name a few, to make sure that their curriculum was aligned to train people to come and work in our systems. That work has happened for over 20 years. I think the organization was founded in the early 2000s, so they are celebrating like 25 years. And once again, it just shows the interconnectivity of people coming together to do this work, but also how it is sustained over a period of time to get these types of outcomes. The last thing I will say, if you've heard anything about Chicago, you know, we have some tough circumstances. And one of the factors that people don't understand or fully appreciate is our principal retention. Prior to us doing this work, only about 75% of our principals were retained year over year. That meant each year we were replacing 25% of our teachers. In Chicago, that's over 100 people, if you can imagine that. When we put these systems in place, made the conditions better for principals, gave them better training, better pay, et cetera, we moved that number to over 91%. So that tells you something. When you can attract highly qualified people and actually keep them, it gives you an indication that the system is working for them.
Of course. And it allows you to work on the long-term goal, which means you have people in place who know how to make the decisions, right? And have been there.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And the other thing I'll say, one extra thing I'll add too is that CPS has experienced a lot of turnover at the top in the leadership position, in the CEO position, you know, from 2000, since Arnie Duncan left in 2008, there were like 10 or 11 CEOs. That's a lot of churn. We would not have been able to see that improvement if we didn't have stability at the local level. So I think for people who are working in places with, big political challenges where leadership changes a lot, really investing in that local leadership and sustainability around that local leadership is a game changer.
100% it is. I completely align with that. And the importance of having a principal also who understands his team and works that way, and having the support structure, as you mentioned, is very, very important. So bringing it towards the work that this organization is moving around literacy, what were the specific challenges or the priorities you set out in this restructuring of the school system? And where does literacy come into play, and sort of how did you manage that?
Yeah, well, it's literacy, as you know, is involved in everything. So I'll talk about a few different initiatives. The first thing was our focus on early childhood education. That was critical. So in Illinois, it is mandatory that students attend school at the age of 5, right after, kindergarten. So we have full day kindergarten. In the past, some students will come to kindergarten reading or beginning readers. In a lot of cases, they did not, especially if they did not have any formal schooling. So a big part of our strategy was to get students into school earlier and also keep them into school longer when we talk about post-secondary. But at the front end, really getting them into pre-K 3, which is for 3-year-olds, and pre-K 4. So we embarked on a pre-K for all initiative, and we did that by prioritizing students in low-income communities first, but it eventually expanded to everybody. We wanted to make sure all of the preschoolers in Chicago had access to pre-K programming with quality certified teachers by the age of 3. This allowed us to begin teaching them early literacy skills. We saw more beginning readers and readers by 5th grade as a result. And it allowed for us to account for some of the socioeconomic differences that show up for students who come from low income backgrounds who don't get formal schooling compared to their peers who did get formal schooling earlier and would come into kindergarten ready to read. So that was number one. The other thing was a strong literacy program for all students. And that included lots of interventions to support kids. We would test our students, see how they were performing. We did a lot of small group instruction to intervene when students needed help. We also have a strong emphasis on bilingual education in Chicago. In fact, the University of Chicago did a study, which I'm happy to share with you, and you can share with participants after this, that actually showed that the students who were in our bilingual program actually outperformed their peers who weren't in the bilingual program because they were getting dual support so that they can both learn and enhance their literacy in their home language, but also learning English so that they can access the tests that they have to take for high school and college here in the United States. And so I would say that strong focus and that comprehensive focus on literacy is something that you see throughout schooling in Chicago. At the high school level, I will say this is probably where it's the most challenging. So folks on this call know that the way that high schools are organized, it's very content specific. I was a former high school principal. I can tell you how hard it is to get high school teachers to teach literacy, yet that was the charge. So we wanted them to teach students how to read, but also to read the content as well. You need to be able to do both, because if students' literacy skills aren't strong enough, they won't be able to access the content fully. And so that was the messaging that we gave to our high schoolers. And we implemented a variety of things. Some things worked, some things didn't. We would do like double periods of English, which is ELA, English Language Arts class, which is like our reading class in high school. We would have double periods of that so that students would get more time, sometimes double periods of reading, sometimes double periods of math, depending on what skill set they had. We also did a fair amount of interim assessments so that we could constantly see if students were developing stronger literacy skills. And then I would also say this is something that we implemented in the district. I can't say it happened universally because it was difficult, but it did happen in a lot of schools. We focused on writing as well, which I think a lot of times when people are implementing strong literacy programs at whatever level, writing is almost like an afterthought or something at the end, where we know that writing is actually the highest form of literacy. And so I think for any program that is focused on this, I would just remind people to implement writing, authentic writing more and more, especially today where our kids don't spend a lot of time generating original material. It's just very different with all the technology. So the more you can create an environment where kids are generating authentic material from their own brains and writing, doing that tactile piece, I think that's critically important. And so I would be remiss if I didn't highlight that in today's discussion.
100%. Thank you. I will definitely come back to AI and the role of technology in literacy, but I would like to dig a little deeper in what you just mentioned, especially focusing on early childhood literacy, as you mentioned, the program you have done there, whereby you have the strategy coming in early and this remedial, almost sounds like almost remedial work, right, that you're doing at the beginning. Can you walk us through that in a bit more detail? How do you get parents to buy into it? How do you get the structure to the like institutions to give you, probably open up the school earlier? What are the challenges around sort of the actual implementation of this? So how do you navigate some of the nitty-gritty, and what were the sort of the key drivers for success, but also some of the key challenges you faced?
Yeah, good question. I would say, let me start with the enabling factors. There were a few things that enabled us to do this work that I think are critically important. Number one, a stake in the ground from both the city as well as the state around literacy. So even today, if you go and look at reports like the state we're in for Illinois, we track student literacy as early as pre-K. We take an assessment called the KIDS assessment, KIDS, and it basically assesses literacy skills in the early grades. And as you can imagine, we look at things like how familiar are they with text, letter recognition, all the basic literacy skills. And I would even say, I don't consider it remediation at that early age. It's really introduction and exploration, right? It's really the things that all students should be doing. But unfortunately, sometimes in a lot of families, they wait for kids to go to school and somebody to teach them how to read. So we just try to get them to school sooner and to enable that process sooner. I think the other thing that is an enabler is that data is public. So I remember when we were implementing that as a district leader, I felt a lot of pressure to make sure we implemented the test with fidelity, meaning all of the students who were eligible took the test, unless there was a circumstance that prevented them from doing it. And then we were also very serious about the reporting, looking at it by school, looking at it by trends, whether that be how our local income students doing compared to their students with more resources, how are Black students doing compared to their Latino counterparts or white counterparts. So we were very serious about unpacking that. I would also say engaging the parents. This is a place where it was a big part of our initiative with mixed results. The number one thing we focused on first was getting parents to enroll their kids in school and bringing them to school. I would say that took up majority of the time, and anybody who's implementing this knows. Now, it may be different in different contexts where if you offer something like this, people show up, they're so excited. But we had to do a fair amount of work. And that, again, is where the community came together. So we had other people, community-based organizations, not just the school, helping us to get to parents and saying, no, this is good for your kids. Even if it's a half day, this is the advantage that your child will get as a result. So bringing parents along. We also had, in not every case, but in some cases, programming, once again, with a university partner, University of Chicago, to work with parents on how to help their kids learn to read. So there's an initiative out of University of Chicago. I cannot remember the professor's name, but it's like the 30 million words initiative or something like that, which basically teaches you that if students are exposed to language earlier. And so we wanted to make sure that students, especially from low-income backgrounds, had that type of exposure, because we know if they're exposed to words early on, it makes it easier to teach them and develop those strong literacy skills. So there was a lot that happened there. We also utilized, and you're going to talk about this later, we did utilize a fair amount of ed tech tools and testing early on to test our students. Get dynamic reporting. We invested early in NWEA, which was a tool we used back then to look at how students were performing, give teachers reports right away so they could do grouping of their students, so they could target discrete reading skills that they needed to focus on. And I think that was a good approach. I will say that there was a period where, and I know this has been covered, where we were focused on whole language and people were kind of stepping back from the science of reading. I'm happy to say in CPS, We never fully stepped away from the science of reading, which thank God we didn't. There was always a focus on phonemic awareness. We would use tools early on to make sure students were getting those skills. So I think that serendip, I mean, I don't know the right term, but it's good for us that we didn't move away from that science of reading. And I would say now CPS has doubled down on the science of reading to really help students catch up.
There's just so many things I want to ask you about, but I'm having to prioritize. I'm wondering, at a certain point, did you pilot things first to start with? Did you start small and then scale, or did you go to scale immediately? Because I'm thinking, so my question is going towards the point of how do you get these things to scale, right? You talked about working with the principal level, which obviously takes you to a scale quite rapidly, given the number of students, the number of teachers you have in the system. Yeah. But what other elements were important to get these things to scale? And maybe that's my first question. Then as a second part, I guess we could talk about policy and the role of the state.
Mm-hmm. I would actually say, first of all, it's a great question. And in many cases, we would pilot things either intentionally, knowing that, and by pilot in CPS, if you got 600 schools or 150 high schools, pilot might be 25 or 50 high schools, which really isn't a pilot in a lot of other places. It's a lot of kids. But we look for research-based proven practices. And I will say part of our leadership, and people have to determine whether or not they're comfortable with this, but a big part of our leadership was large scale change, meaning we would come up with a strategy. We would come up with a plan to implement it district wide. We provide the resources, the support in order to help people buy into it. But a lot of this was policy driven, meaning, here are the outcomes that we're going to be focused on. And here's the professional development and training and strategy to do it. Now, we did give our principals a lot of autonomy, I should say, to say, listen, if you have another way that you want to get there, we'll give you the autonomy to do that. But the outcomes and the deliverables did not change. And so, said a different way, when I was a principal, I would tell my team, here are the outcomes we need to meet according to our strategic plan. I don't care if you stand on your head to get this done, but this is what I expect at the end. And I think when you have those high expectations and you give people support, most people go along with the program. But what I have seen many districts struggle with is they may make these big pronouncements or say where everybody needs to do X, Y, Z, but they haven't really put the systems and structures in place for people to do it with fidelity and to do it successfully. So we would always do a few things. One, we'd have the policy solution connected to it. We would leverage as much as possible technology. That is something that I find uniquely special about CPS. We've embraced technology early on. It's still a struggle, don't get me wrong, but we embraced it early on. And this notion of data-driven decision-making, again, like, people will know how your kids are performing. There will be discussions, whether that's through the networks that you're in or district-wide data. So I think those systems around accountability and support are what are crucial in order to move this work along.
I couldn't be more in alignment. You've emphasized fidelity of implementation a few times, because that's something that we've worked in a lot. I kind of wanted to double click on that again and ask you, what do you find the hardest in terms of getting people to value fidelity of implementation? Because it's not a given, I think, when an institution is aligned around that. So how do you get people to align around the importance of implementing well according to plan?
Yeah, well, that's always the challenge. I think that's the biggest challenge in any organization, especially a large organization like CPS. I think the solutions, and they're not perfect, they're imperfect, and they require a lot of work, are pretty much the same, whether you're in a large district or a school system with 5 schools or lower, which is you have to start with a clear vision. And you have to start with the systems and structure and the organization to pull off what you're asking people to do. So if you want to implement a new math program, for example, and improve math scores by 20%, I'm just making this up. You can't just make an announcement and tell people to go figure it out on their own. You have to give them the playbook. You have to give them the resources, the tools in order to do it. You also must have a strong data and monitoring system. This is, again, a place where I see a lot of people fall short. How do you know people are doing it? It needs to be, you need to leverage technology as much as possible so that you can always tell what's happening in real time, or as much as you can, or as close to real time as possible. And you have to have a system for intervention when people aren't implementing with fidelity. And I think the last piece is communication, constantly communicating the why, and then showing examples of where it works. So like we would do a fair amount of like, you know, people in networks, meaning these are schools that are geographically proximate to each other. So we're going to all sit down with the 25 high schools in this region and let's look at performance. And we're going to lift up school A and B, who is using the district strategy, and let's look at their performance versus school C and D that has decided to do something different. And I think that kind of leadership is what it takes to move things forward. I also want to acknowledge that that is difficult leadership for some people because they're not accustomed to making the work public, to having that kind of public accountability. But if we're serious about moving student data and student improvement, you have to be hold adults accountable for their results. And that's something that we have done in Chicago. It hasn't been perfect. We fight with the union all the time because of that, but it is a staple of how we lead because that is the only way you can make improvement, in my opinion.
I am very aligned on that. Thank you. I think it's incredible to think of the scale at which you were able to deploy so quickly, and I think you're right in highlighting or being very emphatic around the tools and sort of how technology has actually allowed you to do so. And I think accountability is one of the important factors to also get parents involved and also be sort of everyone aligned on the system. So, do you mind now digging in a little deeper into sort of the technology in general? I guess, well, over time it's changed, but specifically today and in the current context with the challenges we have around AI coming up and how it's changing, how do you see this affecting what you've already built? And how do you see it enabling some things going forward? And what are sort of the precautions or the liabilities you see in deploying technology today, given how it's changed over the last few years?
Yeah, it has changed a lot. Well, I'll say a couple things. One, the work that we're doing at the Aspen Institute, we're actually forming a rising generation strategy group where we are bringing together leaders from corporate, civic, education, all of these different industries to talk about the future of education in the USA. And AI and ed tech is one of the 4 areas that we are focused on because it is so critically important. So the first question we're trying to unpack is whether or not AI will be the disruptor to education that we have been told it will be. And the short answer is, I believe so. I think we're already seeing that. But I also think that we know a whole lot more about AI than we give ourselves credit for. And I think that there are a lot of things we can be doing to better prepare students to take on this new challenge. And so that's the work that our group is going to do. We're going to be looking for use cases, we're going to be looking for use cases both in the classroom, but also district-wide that would allow us to unlock a few things that we haven't thought about. So I'll start with the positive things. Number one, could districts run more efficiently using different AI tools, the same way businesses are looking at different tools? I think the value there is that it unlocks dollars that can be used in the classroom to hire more teachers or more interventionists or more tools that are needed to advance learning. So I think that educators and districts should be paying a lot of attention to that. But also, what are the use cases in classrooms that help students use AI effectively? One of the biggest concerns I have, and I remember when, ChatGPT was first introduced, I hadn't heard of it. I was at a tech conference and this was early in the process. Bill Gates was speaking about it. And I was like, wow, why don't I know about it? Well, it had just come out. went back home and, went to my kids' school. Maybe a couple of months later, they had organized a whole, parent event around how to use AI effectively. They had brought the seniors in to help them unpack the AI policies at the universities they would be going to. I mean, just embracing it. And then I was looking at some districts where their first inclination was to ban it. You can't ban it or you can't block it. You have to embrace it, and you have to start creating, knowing that students have this tool now. What is it that you're trying to, how will we get them to demonstrate learning? We have to think about that in new and different ways. And I think that the field of education has to pay attention to that. And it's like any other transformation that happens. I remember when the internet first came out, and I was a student, I had teachers who said, you can't use the internet for articles, which was silly. You still had to go and use microfiche, the old system. It's like, I am not, the skill that I am demonstrating is not my ability to understand what's in the article. I am demonstrating the ability to go and locate something on microfilm. That is not a skill that's going to help me in the world of work. And so I would encourage educators to think about, when we put these tools in front of kids, or we prevent them from using the tools, quite frankly, what is it that we're trying to protect? What skills do we want them to demonstrate, and what is the best way to get them to demonstrate it? The last thing I'll say on AI is that a lot is being made about AI taking over jobs, and there will be some shifts in the job market as a result of this technology, as there always is when there's a technological change this big. But I don't believe that we should be scaring young people into thinking that AI is going to take jobs. I do think you're going to have a harder time getting a job if you're not able to use AI effectively. And so that's what schools should, in my opinion, be focused on. Like, whatever skills or resources or tools are out there in the field, how do we make sure the students that are in our care graduate with the facility to use those tools? And so that's my message to educators around AI. There's so much more to unpack there around policies and things like that, but I think it's something worth embracing. Yeah.
So just one more thing I would like to double click on is, how do you see teachers taking it on as well? Because we talk a lot about how students will learn to use it and be measured. How do we go about teachers? Because it's also a challenge for a lot of people who were educated before, and it's not necessarily as comfortable. It's a challenge, right? Because teachers are now sometimes could know less than a common student given technology. So how do you see that, and how have you been working around that issue in different schools?
The thing that I'm not working directly in schools, but this is what I would say if I were leading a high school now or a school system, which is, like I said, to embrace it. I think we have to go back and train our teachers to use like the flipped classroom model even more effectively now, because we used to spend a lot of time in school with students discovering information and like coming to it. So you read a book or you research an article. Now that can be done quickly. So we need to be spending more time on the analysis and synthesis of all of this information and applying it to a new setting, which those who understand the full cycle of learning know that is the highest level of learning, right? When you can actually take the information you have and apply it in a new and novel setting. That is a different way of teaching than the way we've organized units and classroom discussions. And so the biggest change, I think, is thinking about what are the deliverables or the things we're asking students to do. We know that if you want them to do a research paper on the Revolutionary War, AI can write that for them in 25 seconds. But could they come to school and somehow demonstrate that and act it out using their own words and their own, ways of communicating that? Could we do more project-based learning where they have to produce something new and different that is not generated through AI? I think it's that getting creative. And I actually think that the skills embedded in activities like that are higher level skills, right? Presentation, strong communication, synthesis. So I just think it requires us to think about what we're asking students to do and just reorient how we think about units. I think the other thing that it calls for, which is something that has been talked about a lot, but honestly hasn't gotten off the ground, is competency-based learning, right? So like now we're doing closer to like kids not just doing an assignment and you checking it off, but like, how do they prove competency around a certain set of skills and initiatives? Yeah. I think that teachers should be thinking about how they assess students in new and different ways, especially knowing that they can access information. Push them to go get the information from AI, Google, wherever they get it from. But then when they're in the classroom with you making sense out of it, force them to go deeper than we may have gone in the past, because we're saving so much time because they have access to so much information.
Yeah. I'm very aligned in all that you're saying. I love hearing this. I wanted to dig a little deeper maybe on the policy side. You said that obviously 40 years ago, this did start with a strong buy-in from the state at multiple levels. I think given the context and who's listening here, we're coming from different countries. We're all looking to push forward our literacy as an end goal in the short term, obviously thinking about the whole education system in the long run as well. What would be sort of key elements to consider when, one, dealing with policymakers, but two, sort of, you mentioned it before, communications, I think always thinking about the broader audience to who we're trying to convince as well the importance of this. So thinking more about the like challenges around policymaking, how do you get policymakers on board? How do you keep them on board as well? And so what are some of the lessons, do's and don'ts you might have encountered as well?
Oh, God. I mean, there's so many. I would say, I know everybody has a different context, and how much, and I don't want to say this in a disrespectful way, but different countries have different sets of values around education and who it's for. Different opinions about things like education for all. Do we believe every child deserves access to a high quality education, or do we think, children of a certain background deserve it? So those type of things do come up when you're thinking about policy implementation. I will say even in our country, where we do have an education for all policy and set of values, sometimes we see that not show up in implementation, right? We may say that, but the funding doesn't follow that same model, or we don't we don't spend the extra money in places that need more in order to get to those outcomes. And so I just want to acknowledge that the conditions don't always line up with the values that school systems, elected officials, et cetera, espouse around this issue. What I have found to be more effective is when people think about it, not based on like the future and the geopolitical positioning of the country. I mean, in order for your country to move into a higher position, you have to have a strong, educated populace. And so talking to people about why that's important and why that's necessary, I think is critically important as part of this work. I also think pushing for the funding to support this work is important. I think that is a difficult thing to do, and that's where communication comes in. But if you can show the data and you can show the real impact, I think you can make a stronger case for why a financial investment in education and education programming is necessary. But you really need, I believe strongly in this, you really do need a champion who has power and authority around the policy piece in order for these ideas to come to fruition. I think you can do great work and have bright spots for sure with people doing good work and, under tremendous circumstances. But I think to see it at scale and to move large tranches of students, you have to have leadership. You have to have somebody with power saying that these things matter.
Yeah, that's always a tricky role to play, right? And do you advise that role, for example, to come from a civil society or a third-party organization, or would you consider it better to be within the system, politician or politics-driven?
Well, if it's too politically driven, that creates a bunch of issues. I think the leadership around the what, so like what are we doing, what are we prioritizing, should definitely come from within the district with education experts, et cetera. And they can work in conjunction with entities like universities or nonprofits who focus and support this work for sure. But I think the role of government is really around making sure that the funding exists for, making sure there are good systems for data and reporting that drive this work. That's really their goal and their role. And then I think if you're leading districts in these spaces, showing them the example, showing them what's possible, it allows them to have more belief and allows them to, quite frankly, go and advocate for these things because they have proof points. So I think it's a collective effort. I don't think one entity owns it, outright for sure. Yeah. Like I started the conversation about Chicago, it really is all of these entities coming together to make things work.
Brilliant. I know I could double click on things going backward, but I think we've covered overall. Is there something else that you feel is very important to consider when you're trying to deploy these strategies at a broad scale I think most of the audience is probably civil society oriented, but I think what we want to find is obviously the bridge over with policy and academia. I think that was a very important point you brought up. What other things do you think we should be considering in this conjuncture? I think you've also made very clear, and I think I will emphasize again, the importance of transparency and accountability, platforms serving that, but also policy in place serves that. So what other things that we might have left out that you think should be emphasized again? Or
the only thing I would just double click on is making sure the education system is set up to meet the needs of the larger society, right? So are you producing graduates that help the local economy or industries that your country or region is known for? Are you producing the right graduates, or do you have to outsource a bunch of things because it can't be done in your country? I think when you can start to solve for those issues and can create that bridge, I think you build more collaboration with the corporations, in my opinion. And that's something that we are always striving to do here in the United States. I think there are examples where it works out really well, but then there are some examples where we don't have the connection to the careers in a way that companies value. And so figuring that out is a huge challenge.
Yeah. Well, that's actually something that we work in a lot. So we've touched on a completely different topic that I wasn't necessarily going to go into. But I think what you're saying here, and my interpretation is that actually the importance of planning backwards, right? So, where do we want to go as an end result? Not just in terms of the academic, literacy results, but why is literacy important? Why do we want people to be literate, right? And how does this serve for their futures and probably your country or your city's development, right? So building a picture backwards. Would you say that was part of the process that you've lived through in different organizations, but planning for, I think, future of jobs and understanding the market, and hence what do we need growing up, right? For example, we could double click around STEM and the importance of STEM today, STEM education. Maybe if you could just give a bit of a commentary on planning backward, thinking about the future, as you just said, employment, and double clicking on the importance of STEM today.
Yeah. Well, I think that's been a big hallmark of how we have approached the work in Chicago. We have a diverse and global economy here. And so we want to make sure our students participate in that. And in some cases, a percentage of them do, but a lot of them don't. Or if they do, they're working at, pretty entry levels. And so when CPS, about a little over 25 years ago, decided we were going to have a stronger college going culture, it was to respond to that, because a lot of the industries that we have, here 50 years ago, they were manufacturing and things where you only needed a high school diploma to access. But now it's a lot of service and financial services jobs and information services jobs and healthcare. We have a lot of opportunity here, but we had to make sure we were matching the student skill set with the opportunity. And that required us to do a whole revamp on our college going culture, our our expectations for graduation. So one example would be how science was administered. It used to be that you had to take 3 years of science in order to graduate, and you could take whatever sciences you wanted to. And we would have a large group of kids who would graduate without taking a lab science at all. I mean, literally get through high school without taking a lab science, which you're not focused on STEM if you allow students to do that. And so we changed that policy to say students must have, at least 2 years of a lab science. So that changed curricula, but we didn't just make that proclamation. Going back to my point earlier, we paired that with infrastructure improvements, because some principals said, we would love, Dr. Jackson, we would love to offer physics. Have you been in our physics lab? The beakers, the gas doesn't work, or we don't have tools. So going back to what I said earlier, you can't just make a big pronouncement and say, do it. You have to make sure that you have the infrastructure and the tools. And we did, because we made that change. We had to go to the schools that had science labs that were in the worst state of disrepair and improve them so that they could offer those courses in classrooms that were built to suit that curriculum.
Very much so. Just on a last thought, maybe sustainability, right? I think a lot of the things you've touched upon enable policies and changes to be sustainable. But if you had to sort of maybe highlight what are the key elements that ensure that these things continue over time and work over decades, as you started out saying, this is a long game. It's not a short game. And how do you align things so that the end goals are sustainable, and so the system in place is sustainable?
Well, I think all the things we've talked about, number one, bringing together all those entities. I think if it's something that you're doing alone, it's easy to not be sustainable. When you leave, it's over. But if you have brought corporations in, universities in, if you have brought a whole ecosystem of people from different backgrounds to work on a problem, when one leader changes or one entity is in turmoil, it doesn't go away because it's more entrenched, because a lot of people are working on it. I think policy is a big one. If you're just doing stuff and it's just programming, but it doesn't have like a strong policy framework to undergird it, it's going to go away when the leader isn't there pushing it. So the policy piece is important. And then the last thing I would say is good implementation. If you do implementation well, it will sustain. There are things, when I was leaving CPS, I was worried like, oh God, this is going to fall to the wayside. And of course, there are some things that they stopped doing or they did a different way when I left. But I'm proud to say that many of the changes that I think led to a lot of the strong outcomes, they still do. And when I hear that periodically, it makes me feel good. And I would say I did the same thing. When I was a leader, there was good stuff working. So why would I come in and change it when we already have people rallied around a strategy? We already have the systems and infrastructure to win on a strategy. I think that's something that businesses do well. Government doesn't always do well. And so if you can create those kind of systems that are built for people to win and be successful, they don't change because leadership changes.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I think that's a very, probably the best point we can end on. I think implementation is queen of change, in my opinion. And it's often overlooked. I feel we take it for granted that just like having an idea of where we want to get to is going to get us there. And actually it comes down to the nitty gritty, process driven, small elements and day-to-day changes that make a difference. And I think something else that you've mentioned here, not maybe as explicitly, but is, I think in a way you're saying that the user has to be in the center, right? You're thinking about the parents, you're thinking about the teacher and the students. So making sure that the system is aligned for them and not for others, I think sounds important. I don't know if you have any specific examples around that, but if you did around sort of the user design or user sort of experience that you're sort of highlighting.
I don't have anything else that I would add specifically. If there's a specific example or something that I mentioned, I'm happy to go in depth. But I just think some of the principles I talked about earlier, technology, better implementation, I think all those things are what we thought about. And like you said, communicating it so that people knew the why. If I think about every initiative we led, all of those things were a part of it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So if you don't have any other comments, I have no other questions. So
Okay.
I don't know if you want to say anything else to end on.
Oh, no, thank you for having me here. It's a great discussion, and I look forward to, continuing to follow the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you very much, Janice. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I loved getting to know all your work and all the trajectory. I think it's so valuable, especially given
Thank you.
your experience as a user, as an implementer, as a doer, as everything. And so the whole package is here. So thank you. And I'm sure there was, I took many notes, great lessons for all of us here doing things in Latin America. It was lovely to meet you.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you to all our listeners.
All right. I'll be. Bye-bye.
Bye.